Hi everyone, I'm Rania Imran, a senior majoring in biology at Lawrence University. Today you'll be learning all about my senior project that's about plastic waste and how it affects corals. But before we dive in, we have to understand a key question. What are corals and why should you care about them? Corals are marine invertebrate animals that live in the ocean. Corals make up what is known as a reef. A reef is one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. These corals come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors. Their shape allows corals to provide shelter and food for fish, which contributes to 25% of the ocean's fish population. Coral reefs only cover 1% of the Earth's surface, but they contribute to the livelihood of over 275 million people. Different environmental stressors, such as climate change and pollution, can deplete the reef of healthy corals and can cause long-lasting damage to coral reef systems. Speaking of pollution, let's get back to the concept of plastic waste. When you think of plastic, you may think of shopping bags, plastic bottles, and plastic packaging. These are macroplastics, or large pieces of plastic, with a diameter of greater than 50 millimeters. The demand for macroplastics has grown tremendously in recent years. The global annual plastic products produced in 2018 were 359 million tons. That's approximately the weight of 60 million full-grown killer whales worth of plastic being produced annually. At this rate of plastic production and demand, by 2025, it is predicted that there will be 250 million tons of plastic waste present at sea. Most of the plastic pollution on land tends to run off into the ocean over time. The plastic debris runoff contributes to approximately 60 to 80% of marine pollution. This can affect over 267 marine species' health and well-being, many of which we may know and love. The presence of plastic in the ocean can be incredibly harmful, especially when these macroplastics are gradually broken down into what is known as microplastics, or small pieces of plastic. These small pieces of plastic have a diameter of less than 5 millimeters in size. These large pieces of plastic are fragmented into microplastics through physical abrasion, UV photodegradation, biodegradation through microbes in the ocean, hydrolysis, which is water pressure, and even biological ingestion by different marine species. This brings me to the purpose of my literature review. The purpose was to see if there is a direct relationship between microplastic exposure and the fitness of corals. So I hypothesized there's a direct relationship between increasing microplastic exposure and decreasing fitness among different species of corals. The focus within these species is on their overall health, behavior, and feeding practices. Now, I'd like to tell you a little more about the physiology of corals and the kind of corals I chose for my literature review and why. Corals fall within the class Anthozoa of the phylum Cnidaria. This class has two subclasses. First, let's talk about Octocoralia, which is a subclass for soft corals, such as red sea whips, because they do not have a rock-like calcareous skeleton. However, Hexacoralia is a subclass for stony corals and sea anemones because their body is made up of a rock-like calcareous skeleton. These are known as scleractinia corals, or stony corals. There are two types of scleractinia, hermatypic and ahermatypic. Hermatypic corals contain symbiotic algae, which are algae that have a mutualistic relationship with the coral where they both benefit. These hermatypic corals also make skeletons to build reefs and often form colonies through tissue connections among neighboring corals. Hermatypic corals are reef-building corals. Ahermatypic corals, however, do not have symbiotic algae and do not contribute to reef development. Today, we will be focusing on hermatypic scleractinia corals. Now that we have some background knowledge, I'd like to introduce the title of my senior capstone: The Effects of Microplastics on the Behavior, Feeding, and Health of Reef-Building Corals. The title is a perfect segue into coral feeding. How do corals feed, you might be wondering? Well, corals are both heterotrophs and autotrophs, which means some corals are producers and consumers of energy. A heterotroph consumes other organisms for energy. Like this cat may end up consuming a mouse for energy. Autotrophs, however, produce their own energy, like this plant does through photosynthesis. Corals can produce their own energy and consume other organisms such as zooplankton for energy as well. Corals are able to be autotrophs because of that mutualistic relationship I mentioned earlier with zooxanthellae, or a symbiotic algae. Most reef-building corals feed through this symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, which lives in the coral. This relationship works through physiological processes of producing CO2 and photosynthesis. The zooxanthellae provide the color to these beautifully unique and diverse corals. However, when they are stressed out through different environmental stressors such as plastic pollution, they release it through the form of mucus, which can make corals appear white or bleached. This appearance is commonly referred to as coral bleaching, and they can actually have declined health and ultimately die because of this. Now you must be wondering, where exactly does zooxanthellae reside within a coral? It resides in the polyps of a coral, which are able to survive as individuals and in large colonies of coral species, thus building the reef structure. There's a tissue portion of the body called the mesoglea that keeps several individual polyps connected with one another in a reef system. These polyps have a mouth that is encircled with tentacles. This is where the heterotroph quality of the coral come in to eat zooplankton. And now that we've covered how they're autotrophic, these tentacles are used by coral to capture their prey manually as a source of energy, in addition to corals feeding through their symbiotic relationship. Now, you and I both know I wouldn't be doing my capstone on this if everything was going good for the corals, unfortunately. Now, let's get to the issue here. How is coral feeding disrupted? Remember those microplastic particles I mentioned earlier and how they're also a part of my title? Well, you guessed it. Those microplastic particles are the culprit. The manual feeding mechanism can be disrupted by pollutants present in the water. Why? Because zooplankton and microplastics are about the same size, and zooplankton are a key component of a coral's diet. So when microplastics and zooplankton are both free-floating in the reef system, this can cause corals to ingest microplastics due to size similarity. Microplastics suspended in the water interfere with the tentacle feeding mechanism, which can influence coral energetics, growth, and well-being, with consequences relating to feeding, behavior, and health. Corals end up spending more time on average handling pollutants to decipher if they can ingest them or not. This results in a decrease in the rate at which they can successfully capture and ingest zooplankton, thus negatively affecting their feeding. This prolonged pollutant handling results in a loss of energy and a gut full of microplastic particles, contributing to the coral stress. So microplastic ingestion affects autotrophic and heterotrophic feeding. It also influences the coral's symbiotic algae through the release of algae in the form of mucus as a stress response. The coral will be suffering in a multitude of ways over time. However, microplastics aren't the only thing stressing our corals. There are many other threats to coral reefs. Coral diversity and health have decreased significantly due to human causes and global climate change. There has been a spike in coral diseases that are related to land-based pollution, such as deforestation, oil, and chemical spills, to name a few. This disrupts the broader environment surrounding coral, such as the fish and zooplankton communities. You must be wondering now, wow, Ganya, there's a lot going wrong with the reefs. There must be no way for me to help. Well, actually, there are some ways you can help, so be happy. In fact, I've got a list of ways you can help related to plastic usage and the other pollution threats to reefs. Number 1. Use sustainable items in place of plastic products such as a toothbrush, spray bottle, and dispensers with bamboo, glass, and metal alternatives. 2. Swap single-use plastic for sustainable options such as reusable grocery bags and produce bags. 3. Try to buy products that are glass and metal as opposed to their plastic counterparts. 4. A really easy one is to have a mason jar for all of your coffee dates instead of a disposable plastic cup every time you visit. 5. Maintain a proper septic system function with the inspections and pump outs every 3 to 5 years. 6. Wear sunscreen with ultraviolet protection factor, UPF, to protect marine life. 7. Pick up after your pets when they go potty outdoors. 8. Wash your car on the lawn to prevent runoff into sewage. 9. Do not dump paint, oil, antifreeze, or other household chemicals into the street drainage. 10. Clean up spilled brake fluid, antifreeze, grease, and oil after yourself. I understand sustainability comes with a privilege, so do the best you can in your means. Every little bit helps. Thank you so much for listening to my capstone educational presentation today, and I hope you have a good one.